To Diep, hello everyone. Wishing you all good health and peace in life. Sometimes it's not the storms outside that shake us, but the people from our past who refuse to let us move on. When CEO James offered to build the Diep a new house, he wasn't just offering shelter, he was offering comfort, safety, and a future. But not everyone was ready to let her go. Her ex-husband, a man who once held her heart but never knew how to protect it, suddenly returned. Not with love, but with resistance. He didn't want James to be the one who helped her rebuild. Not because he cared, but because he couldn't stand the thought that someone else could love her better than he ever did. Now, standing between what was and what could be, Diep must choose. Will she allow the past to define her future, or will she finally let love lead the way? The wind carried the scent of earth and fresh cut wood across the hills that surrounded the quiet countryside where Diep had once known both love and loss. She stood at the edge of her land, eyes scanning the half-built wooden structure in the clearing ahead, her future home, a place meant to mark a new beginning. And standing beside her, sleeves rolled up, brows furrowed in determination, was James, the CEO who had once lived among sky-high buildings and glass offices, now grounding his heart in soil, love, and the woman who had taught him simplicity. But peace, it seemed, was not something one could build with nails and timber alone, because from the moment the first wooden beam was laid, shadows from the past had begun to stir. Diep's ex-husband, had been gone for years. After their bitter divorce, he vanished without much of a goodbye, leaving behind debts and shattered promises. Diep had rebuilt herself, slowly, selling vegetables at the local market, helping her neighbors, and learning to live again. Meeting James had not been part of her plan, and falling in love again had felt almost like betrayal to her old self, to the pain she'd buried. But love found its way in, quiet and sincere, and just when things felt safe enough to bloom. Pao returned, not with remorse or warmth, but with fire in his eyes and pride bruised. He showed up one morning, uninvited, as workers nailed down roofing panels and children passed by to watch the house take shape. His voice boomed through the field like a sudden thunderclap. "This house is a lie," he shouted. "She doesn't need your charity, James. She doesn't need you." The workers froze. James turned calmly to face him, but Diep's heart sank. Pao was never good with emotion. When he hurt, he burned. When he lost control, he made others pay. "Pao," she said, stepping forward, her voice calm but shaking, "you lost the right to tell me what I need a long time ago." Pao's eyes flicked to her, then to James. "You think this man loves you? You think this big CEO came here just for you? What happens when he gets bored of mud and chickens?" James stayed silent, but his gaze never left Pao's. "I'm not here for mud or chickens," he said finally. "I'm here for her." Pao's jaw clenched. He stepped closer to James. "She was mine." James didn't flinch. "She was never yours to own." The next few days were tense. Pao loitered around the village, whispering to the neighbors, trying to stir doubt, questioning James's intentions. "He's building a house so he can control her," he said. "What kind of man takes another man's wife and builds on his land?" It hurt Diep more than she let on. Her hands shook while preparing food. She avoided the market. Guilt, though misplaced, gnawed at her ribs. But James never pressured her. He just kept working, meeting the carpenters early, managing budgets late into the night, all while giving her space. One evening, under the glow of oil lamps and the sound of cicadas, Diep sat beside James as he sanded down a wooden window frame. She watched his hands, blistered, rough now, but full of care. "Why do you stay?" she asked softly. He looked at her, surprised by the question. "Because I believe in this in us, and because sometimes home isn't where you're born, it's who you build with." A tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. But Pau wasn't done. One night, he returned with men strangers claiming he still had rights to the land. They argued, waving old papers and legal threats. James had prepared for this. With the help of a local lawyer and some connections, he calmly presented proof that the land had been transferred, debts paid, and no claim remained. James sat beside her. "Love isn't a cage, Diep. It's a door we open together. You can walk away anytime, but if you stay, I'll make sure this place feels like freedom, not fear." She leaned against his shoulder. For the first time, the past felt far behind her, and the house, not yet finished, not yet perfect, already felt like home. The rainy season arrived earlier than expected. Each afternoon, dark clouds gathered above the hills, and the sound of raindrops tapping on the half-finished roof became the soundtrack of their evenings. The wooden house stood strong, but it needed completion and fast. James worked with urgency but calmness, speaking to local suppliers, adjusting timelines. Diep admired how he didn't panic under pressure. His world was once one of boardrooms and investors, but now he stood ankle-deep in mud, hands blistered, wearing the same faded shirt for days. He wasn't doing this for show. He was building their life, piece by piece, but behind Diep's smile was a secret, one she hadn't even admitted to herself. It started with dizziness in the morning, the sudden aversion to the smell of boiled eggs, the emotional tears she couldn't explain when James handed her a flower he'd found near the stream. At first, she thought it was stress. Then she remembered the dates. She bought a pregnancy test in the market, hidden carefully between the bundles of spinach and sweet potatoes. That night, after James had fallen asleep, she lit a candle in the small temporary room they stayed in beside the house. Her hands trembled as she waited for the result. 2 lines. Her breath caught. She sank down onto the floor, heart thudding. The silence of the night seemed heavier than usual. The wind outside whistled through the unfinished window frames, and she suddenly felt very small and very unsure. Could she raise a child here, in this uncertain world, with her past haunting the edges and her future still unfinished? She didn't tell James right away. For days, she watched him from across the field, her hand brushing her belly as he laughed with the workers, his kindness shining even when he thought no one noticed. She wanted to be sure that this life growing inside her would be born from peace, not fear. But the past was not done testing them. Pau returned once more, this time alone. His eyes no longer carried fire. Instead, they were filled with something even more dangerous, regret. "I came to say goodbye," he told her, standing just outside the garden where she was harvesting. "Morning glories. I'm leaving for good." Diep stayed silent. "I was angry because I lost you, and seeing you build something better without me, it burned." He looked down at his hands. But I see now. I see how he treats you. He's not me. She nodded slowly. No, he's not. He took a deep breath. Is it true? You're carrying his child. She froze. He chuckled bitterly. The market talks, even when it whispers. She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Then take care of that child, he said. Don't let the past bleed into their future. And then he left, quietly, for real this time. That evening, Diep finally told James. He was sitting under the half-finished porch, watching the rain. I'm pregnant, she said softly. He turned to her slowly, eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. Then, with a voice just above a whisper, he asked, Are you okay? She nodded, tears in her eyes, scared. But yes. He stood, walked to her, and knelt down. Gently, he placed a hand on her belly. Then we'll do this together. Every step. I don't know how to be a father, but I know how to love. She laughed through her tears, and they stood there, in the doorway of their almost finished house, holding each other tightly while the rain fell around them. It didn't matter anymore that the roof wasn't finished or that shadows of the past still lingered in the village. What mattered was this, to hearts, steady in the storm, ready to build something even greater than a house, a family. Life lesson, true love builds, even in the storm. Life rarely goes as planned, sometimes. Just when we think we've left the past behind, it returns louder, heavier, and more complicated. But in those moments, we discover something deeper, the strength of love, and the courage it takes to begin again. The story of Diep and James is not just a love story. It is a story of healing, rebuilding, and choosing peace over pride. When Diep's ex-husband Pao returned to disrupt her new life, it would have been easy for her to break down, to question her choices, or to give up. But she didn't, because real growth doesn't happen when life is easy. It happens when we stand firm in the middle of the storm. James, a successful CEO, didn't fight back with words or money. He didn't try to prove he was better. Instead, he showed his love through patience, quiet protection, and unwavering support. He helped Diep not because he wanted to win against her past, but because he believed in her future. That's what love looks like. It builds. It doesn't control. Pao's final act of stepping away with grace teaches another important lesson. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in letting go. Not every story has a perfect ending. Not every wound heals the way we want, but when we release what no longer belongs, we free ourselves and others to find peace. Diep's pregnancy becomes the symbol of a new beginning. Life will always test us with rain, doubts, and unexpected news. But if we choose the right people, if we build our lives with kindness and truth, no storm can truly shake us. So, the lesson is simple yet powerful. The past may knock at your door, but only you decide who gets to stay. Choose those who build with you. Choose love that is steady, not loud. Choose peace even when it's the harder road. And most of all, believe that even after broken pieces, something beautiful can still grow.